My name is Max Jacquard. I'm a glass caster based in Kent, in the southeast corner of England. And my studio is in a really rural situation on a farm, and I live 5 minutes away from where I work, so my situation hasn't really changed much during the coronavirus lockdown. I'm still able to continue working here in the studio, and I'm splitting my time looking after my two sons and working on my own in the studio, and sometimes trying to combine the two things. I've been working in glass for many years and have covered lots of different techniques during the course of my practice. But in the last 10 years or so, I've become more increasingly focused on a technique which would be referred to as core casting, where you're actually making an inner space inside the glass that has a different quality to the outer space, and looking at the inner space very often through the surface, be that textured or polished, at a different world that's within the piece. Can everybody hear me? Are you hearing me, Paul?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so that little intro formed the first couple of minutes of a video that I made recently for the gas conference, which many of you may have been involved with this year. It couldn't happen in Sweden, was scheduled to happen in May, and of course that will have to be cancelled. So they had it online over the course of the 4 days that was, or 3 days that the conference was going to be happening, but everybody made videos of their presentations, and actually it was hugely successful, and particularly for me, because I was going to be demonstrating my core casting technique. And so for a couple of months prior to the cancellation, I'd been thinking, right, well, what am I going to need to take with me to Sweden? What kind of a workshop am I going to be faced with? Am I going to be able to demonstrate plaster casting, wax working, casting in the kiln? All of those things would have been extremely difficult in a live situation. So actually, by making a video, it kind of played into my hands, really, because I was able to synthesize all of the processes that I use and wrap them up into the course of about a 3-day sequence that I just shot the highlights of. So that was the first few minutes, and then we go into a huge amount of practical demonstration, which I've decided to omit for this evening's talk. So what we're going to do is just go into a little cross-sectional drawing of the pieces that I made in the demonstration to give you a kind of an idea about how it's done. So these are the drawings that followed that video, and if any of you are familiar with the process of casting, very often it's done using a lost wax process, where you make a perfect replica of your object in wax. You surround that with a plaster-based investment, and then you steam out the wax, leaving a cavity into which the glass flows. Now, this process, this development of the casting process, uses a separate core and outer, which enables you to do two objects in one, if you like. With glass, you're always looking through the object at the same time as at the surface of it. So if you have a negative space inside the object, which is different than the outside space, you've got a very interesting dialogue going on, and an interesting sort of area of symbolism if you're working within the art kind of field. So the piece that I won the Glass Sellers Award with was called Limb, and that was way back in 2001. And it was, the idea was to combine a wooden branch with an arm of a human being. So the arm was on the outside and the wooden branch was on the inside. Therefore, you've got two objects in one, and you've got the symbolic kind of marrying of the human with the vegetable world, I suppose. So what I'm going to show you after the rest of the video is a selection of works that's all been made with this core casting process. So we're going to start really simple and then show you the more complicated versions of this technique. So back to this image, we're starting with a very simple core that I like to teach students of casting. In order to do this, we're using a found object, namely a flexible rubber bowl, and we're pouring plaster into that bowl to make the core that you see in front of you. So if you can pull up the next slide, Paul. Around that central core, we then dip the wax, and it's a bit like candle making. If you start with a wick and you can then dip repeatedly into a molten pot of wax and it coats the surface. So in this case, we're just coating the core with a layer of wax over the top. And then obviously how far we dip in depends upon where the object is going to finish. So that's the wax over the top of the core, and I've built it up with about 5 or 6 layers of wax there to create a thickness of about 2 to 3 millimeters. So the next image, this shows the outer mold, which is poured in a separate firing, or in a separate casting rather, after we've replaced the core back onto the bench. So in order to get the outer mold to surround completely the inner core, we set it up on a little clay foot on top of the bench so that the outer investment mold can completely surround that inner mold, trapping it inside so it can't go anywhere, it can't float. And then you see at the top there's this little feed-in point. That's important for getting the glass to flow into the form. So this whole mold will be turned upside down and placed in a steamer. In the trade, it's called an autoclave, and I like to use a commercial Baby Burco boiler with a little trivet standing in the bottom, turn it upside down, and in about half an hour, once that water has reached a rolling boil, all the wax will be removed from that little cavity there, leaving a hollow space into which the glass can flow. So it's like making a mold from the inside out, and it takes a little bit of a sort of back to front thinking, but once you've done it, then you can understand the possibilities for developing this technique into some really complex forms, which I'm going to show you at the end of the video. So any questions before we show the second half of the video?
Somebody is muted. I can hear attempt to talk. So it's fascinating. I'm not quite sure I understand all of it yet, Max, but I'm sure it'll become obvious as you progress.
Yeah, it might do, or it might remain a mystery.
Well, from your point of view, you probably want it to remain a mystery. Keeps the competition out. I
don't know. It's an interesting point, because I've found that the more I introduce people to it, the more kind of, in a way, the more followers I get, and the more, I suppose, people become interested in my own work. And
Sure, that's right.
It's interesting, particularly because this video, in a sense, was like a how-to video, and one or two people have contacted me since then saying, "Oh, I'd really like to do it. Can you tell me where to get the materials, etc., etc." And one lady who's a good friend of ours has done something very, very similar to the pieces that I completed in the video, which you'll see at the end.
Bill wants to ask a question, I think. Bill?
Yes, a quick one, Max. How do you turn that space left by the wax into an interesting artistic shape?
You add texture to it. So what that really is a blank for me to then work on top of. And so I did 3 different approaches. I did 3 examples of the same blank, and one of them I dribbled wax all over the surface of it, creating like a really crazy pattern. And on the other 2, I carved the wax with different types of tools. In fact, they were very similar, sort of serrated clay tools, kind of creating a kind of sgraffito type texture. But the difference between the 2 carved pieces was really quite striking. So you've got like a kind of broad base for mark making, which could be either added on by modeling or carved away. And so from that start point, you've got all sorts of permutations going off from there, and it goes into real minute nuances of different sizes of tool doing the same basic carving process, which produces a very different kind of optical effect with the glass.
If we show the next video, then a lot of this will come into a much better understanding, I think.
Yeah.
So we'll do that, shall we?
Sure, let's go. Just a little bit of space around them so the air can flow through. And I think that is probably about the perfect size of kiln for this type of casting. Okay, so bless the kiln. Hope for the best, although I know it's going to be a good casting. So this is where the kitchen knife comes in handy. It's got a good rounded end that makes it very nice for separating the mould. Be very careful about this bit, it's sharp. So this is the demoulding of the glass. And you can see in the front there the pieces of glass having melted into that cavity. I'm removing the inside investment material. It needs repeated soaking in water to soften the investment. And that also keeps the dust down. Phew, well, that was pretty full on. But thanks to the dexterity of my favourite butter knife, everything was removed safely without any breakages. And I've got remaining 3 very beautiful, very delicate glass cups, which have this lovely ring to them, so I know that they're properly annealed. This one is really delicate, different ring, interestingly, and this one, which is the one that was quite quick to make, and another different ring with the dribbles of wax all down around the outsides, but it does look quite fantastic, you see from inside. Just in case you think that I'm using heavy machinery to do the finishing on these pieces, I want to give you a quick view of my main tool for finishing, which is a hand piece for a flexible drive, and I'm using it in conjunction with the electrostatic 3M pads from His Glass and a flexible backer, which allows the pad to follow the curve of the inside. And with this I am able to finish both the inside surface and the outside to give it a little pre-polish before I go on to the brush polishing. And here we are at the last bit of equipment that we need to finish these pieces, which is the brush polisher on a lathe, and it is the only really heavy piece of equipment that I've been using so far. You could do this polishing on the flexible drive using either some pulper polishing pads or a felt pad impregnated with pumice or cerium, but I'm using the brushes because I can get into the grooves and the detail, and it puts a more of a lustrous finish on it. So that'll take me about 5 minutes per piece, and then we'll have a look at them. So that's a solution of pumice that I'm using on the wheel. So come to the end of another lovely spring day in England, 2020, with the rest of the country more or less in lockdown still. I've finished my little journey with these bowls, and I'm very pleased with the way they've turned out. I could probably go back to them, do a bit more polishing, bring the finish up a little bit more, but as far as it goes, they've given me back more than what I expected they would when I started. And what I want to emphasize is that this is not an ending, really, it's just a beginning. And doing something like this, which has taken me about 3 working days total to get to this point, has actually enabled me to assess all sorts of different things to do with the process and to do with the mark making and to do with the ideas behind the work. So I'll be coming back to this work now with a real excitement to see what I can do with it, how I can refine some of the qualities, and what happens when I scale up as well, because really this is a test for the kind of qualities you can achieve with this kind of casting on a small scale, but which apply themselves to a much larger scale piece. And I hope that you've also picked up some interesting ideas for your own work. I mean, there's all sorts of little techniques going into these which could be applied to other end products, not just vessel forms but castings, not just hollow cast forms but also solid cast forms. So thanks for watching. Hope you are enjoying what you can of your particular coronavirus crisis scenario, and let's hope that after it's all over we'll be able to get back into our glass work with renewed vigour, and hopefully there will be a world out there that's waiting to enjoy what we can make with our skills. Thank you. So those are the 3 pieces I made. Those 2 are carved, and that one is added with molten wax. Just to kind of think about the sustainability of it, we're using optical crystal. Those 2 are probably my most expensive items. apart from that, a lot of the materials we use are very found. This is a good reflection on actually the dipping process, and that's the waste. Quite a lot of electricity. Right, there we go.
Wonderful.
Very good.
So if anybody wants to kind of go back into the bits in between, there's probably about 20 minutes or so of me doing the dipping of the core and the modeling of the wax and the various steps in the process between the start and the point at which I put them in the kiln.
Max, may we ask questions?
Yes, yes, indeed.
There's a terminology that you used, investment material.
Yes.
What's the origin of the word investment relative to the material that you're using?
It comes from the Latin vestere, to clothe, and the root of the word went also into the term investment as a banking term, because it was considered that you would wrap up your money or your valuables and place them in somewhere where they would increase in value. So I love the parallels between the idea of wrapping up your precious mold in an investment and wrapping up your nest egg in an investment. I guess it's the same sort of outcome, really, unless it all goes horribly wrong, of course, in the kiln, which it always can do.
Absolutely wonderful. And my second question, I saw you had a Geisen sandblaster in the background there.
Yeah.
What do you actually sandblast? Is it the finished glass, or is it part of the process?
We do quite a lot of sandblasting on our finished pieces. One of the drawbacks to investment casting is that the glass doesn't come off the surface of the mold cleanly. It very often carries with it a slight bloom from the interaction of the glass and the plaster-based material. And in order to get a nice shine to the work or a nice clean finish, you have to strip off that outer skin. And so very often with finishing techniques on castings, we will do our cold working using grinding wheels, diamond products, etc., and then we would then give everything a sandblast over with a very soft grade of grit, and then we would either brush polish, as I showed in the video, or you could also use acid to bring that back up to a shine. It depends on what you want for the final finish. And we also use sandblasting for the engravings that we do, which particularly with one of the sort of arms of my business commercially is doing mementos for families of newborn babies. So we would do babies' hands and feet, and we will engrave using the sandblaster the name of the baby onto the plaque or the polished part of the glass. So it's very handy for that.
Yeah.
Does that bring you to the point where you'd like to see the next photograph?
Yes, that would be a good idea.
Just a second, because that is quite fascinating.
Oh.
So this is kind of especially coming from the the Glass Sellers Prize that I won in 2001, which I spoke about at the beginning, where I tried to combine the image of an arm and a branch in one object. So the branch that you see running through the middle of this arm is an ivy root. You know, the kind of things that you see climbing up the trunk of a tree. And it has a particularly visceral kind of feel to it, the way it kind of snakes along. And by making that ivy branch in a pre-made investment core and then suspending it inside a wax of an arm, I was able to cast the two things in one. So I was able to get the glass to flow down from the point where the shoulder is in that piece all the way to the tips of the fingers, and effectively encapsulate that, that ivy root in the inside of the piece. So that was a piece that I exhibited at the British Glass Biennale about 2004. This is another development of the core casting process, where I made some castings of some gladioli bulbs, or no, this was the tulip bulbs. So I had these tulip bulbs, made a silicon casting from them, and then poured investment into that, and then anchored the tulip bulb positives into a negative, into a wax shape with just the tips sticking up, so that when I poured the investment around the wax, the tulip bulb positives were locked into the negative. So what you're seeing is this silvery quality of the bulbs is actually a negative space, and the shoots that grow up from the tops of the bulbs are actually positives, and they are stoppered into the necks of the bulb cavities. Quite a tricky one to understand what's going on visually there. This piece was inspired by Roman glass, and I did a study of ancient glass making methods, and I became fascinated by the parallels between my own process and the early glass made before the invention of blowing. So I looked at a lot of examples of Roman glass in the British Museum, and also from the frescoes in Herculaneum, and I kind of, and also the Islamic glass, the Sasanian and the Mesopotamian glass, of which there is a fantastic example in the British Museum of the earliest glass vessel called the Sargon vase. And that piece was probably made by investment casting using the lost wax process. But this carving process is something which I did on a core, where I cast a core very similar to the one that I showed in the demonstration, and then deep carved it with a chisel, and then dipped it in wax to create the outside. So this is a bigger piece than the demonstration piece, but it's made in exactly the same method. This piece is also a core cast that references antique glass, in the sense that what I took for the core was a Georgian decanter. You can just make out the form of it inside with the cross-cut cutting marks in there. So I took the decanter and I made a replica of the decanter in the investment plaster, and then I wrapped the whole thing in cloth, as if it had been packaged for transportation in a cargo ship or something. And then I cast the outside of the cloth in wax, and then I removed all of the cloth and cast the gap between the cloth and the decanter, leaving the decanter visible in negative in the middle of the object.
Pretty incredible.
Yeah. And this is another one in that same series of wrapped decanters, where I took a square whiskey decanter and I wrapped it in a round form with bubble wrap around the outside. So the texture that you see on the outer is created by bubble wrap, and the form on the inside is created by the decanter. So they're kind of like visual games, really. And this little piece is one of the kind of spin-offs from that project, which was a series of tumblers that I made with bubble wrap wrapped around the outside. So again, it's a simple core in the inside that's then dipped in the wax, and then I create a texture of bubble wrap, which is then wrapped around the outside, and then I'm casting the whole thing. There's quite a lot of polishing on that one. This is a sequence of pieces which I made last year, and it's all about, this is all made by turning the objects, both the cores and the outside, on the lathe, and I'm turning a sequence of waves into the shape in the core and then making a smooth outer around that. So this one is kind of like a cosmic egg, really, a bit like the rings of, thinking about the rings of Saturn and the idea of energies within things. The color that you see there is a kind of ruby glass pigment that I'm actually mixing in with my lead crystal rod that you saw in the video, and then it's feeding in through the top entry point of the mold and dragging that pigment down with it as it goes into the cavity. So you get these amazing streaky color effects that's really caused by the way in which the piece is cast. That's another piece in the series which I call the Semazines, and the word Semazine does anybody know what a Semazine is?
No.
It's basically a whirling dervish. So they have this ceremony called the Sema, and it's a kind of the idea of connecting energies between the earth and the heavens. And so the dancer, the whirling dervish, is a bit like a kind of an energy conductor between the divine and the earthly. And so I've used that kind of idea in a lot of these objects, where you've got this kind of wave form with a load of wave forms inside it. So it's kind of scientific, but also sort of spiritual as well. So this is my more kind of sculpture, the more sculptural end of the work that I'm doing with core casts. This form, the form that you see here and the form that you saw before, was actually inspired by looking at oscilloscope readings from AM radio waves. So you know the way that an AM radio wave goes, it's like a kind of carrier wave with all the vibrating waves kind of inside that carrier wave. This is a hanging piece, and these are also hanging light objects. I presented those at the design week last September. So that's a development on from those sculptural forms. And these objects are the last ones that I want to show you. This is what's on the bench this week, waiting to be finished. And it's interesting because it's a kind of a commission project that's come out of doing those Semazine pieces. But I've actually, it was a friend of mine in New Zealand who's a jeweler, and she asked me if I could recommend any glass casters in New Zealand that would be up for making some light shades. And I thought, well, actually, I've done all this work on lighting and glass. I don't really want to let anybody else do it. So I said, well, I'll do the commission, and send it out to New Zealand, no problem. And she's asked me to produce 3 shades that would be simple pendant shades in jewel like colours. So the one on the left is my lead crystal glass with the pigments in, doing this kind of drag down effect. And the one on the right is a Czech casting glass that's just a single colour. And I was just trying them out really to compare the results of the two. And you can see that it's got very fine markings on the outside, which is carved in the same way that I carved the wax bowls in the demonstration. So coming from that project, where I was just really trying out different ways of working, and then referring back to the work that I'd done with the lit sculptures, we've come up with a more functional object that's actually meeting the demands of a particular brief. So it's often the way it goes with my work, you know, that there's this interchange between the commercial projects that I do and the techniques that I use, and then, you know, something will trigger my imagination and give me an idea for a piece of sculptural work, and then in turn that piece of sculptural work can then feed back into something more commercial, more commission based, which I really like, that interplay between those projects that I do. You know, I don't always think it's about making a profit out of one job. It's about the flow, in a way, the flow between the idea, the technique, and the potential outcomes.
How did you come across the Semazine and the dervishes?
Well, I went to Istanbul for a visit a while back, and whilst we didn't actually go to the temple and see the whirling dervishes, I had that idea in my mind, and I was thinking about kind of ethereal things that whirl and that spin, like will-o'-the-wisps and tornadoes and water going down the plug, and then I was thinking about giving that a human form. So I was looking for an example of where a spinning phenomenon takes a human form. And so I started reading up about the whirling dervishes and why they do it, and what they feel the energy is all about. And then suddenly it became very poetic to me, you know, and it actually made me realize, well, this is one of the reasons why I'm interested in this idea of the spinning form. And actually also I started doing the Tibetan 5 rites as a recommendation from some bronze caster friends of mine who are very fit, and they keep very active. And I say, how do you keep so fit? Do you have a workout regime? And they go, no, we just do the Tibetan 5 rites. And the Tibetan 5 rites starts off with spinning, and you actually put your arms out to the sides, you stand on the spot and you spin clockwise 21 times, and then you try not to fall over. But it's interesting what that does to you, to your sense of balance and everything, and that kind of came together with this body of work. You know, I was spinning myself, and I'm looking at images of spinning figures and thinking, oh yeah, there's something here that's inspiring to work with.
Did you, when you're doing the wrap decanters, is the investment inside the decanter? Do you have to get that out?
Well, in order to achieve that, I had to make a silicon mold of the decanter.
Right.
So with a lot of our processes, we're using sculptors' techniques to get from objects in one material to another. Namely, we want to try and get into wax a lot of the time, but also working with the direct core casting process, we're aiming to get into investment material. So we need a mold into which we can pour a plaster type material.
Yeah.
And what we're doing is we're painting things with silicon. So you can mix up silicon so that it's very gloopy and thick, and you can paint layers on, rather like how you do the old candle molds. Do you remember Jemima Puddle Duck?
Yeah.
Making your candle molds with latex. Silicon's actually a lot faster, and you don't need so many coats. But it creates like a kind of sock around the object, which you can then peel off once it's dry, and then you put it back together as a perfect negative copy of the object, into which you then pour either your wax or your investment.
Wow.
So yeah, so you're making very often with a lot of those pieces. I had to make two molds, one for the outer shape and one for the inner shape, and then I join them together once they're made in investment plaster. So it's like putting the pieces of a puzzle back together and locking it in so that it can go back into the mold, into the kiln, and be fired up to high temperatures without floating or falling apart.
So when you have these wonderful ideas, do they work out every time? How many casualties do you have?
You do tend to get quite a lot, and after a while you learn to approach it strategically. So you find out what you need to know about your mold and about how the glass is going to flow into the piece, and about what your options with color and texture are, and then also how you're going to finish the work by doing a prototype or by doing a mock-up in a small scale. So with those bowls that you saw in the video demonstration, that's a really good example of how I'm able to work out how the thing comes together and how it works, and also what the effects are visually of the marks that I'm making on the glass, without risking a huge firing that's going to take days in the kiln. Those little molds went into a small kiln, and I'm able to establish the principles by which they work and how they look when they come out, and then that informs my next step. So that's why it showed that image at the end, because those lamps at the end were only possible because I'd done all the R&D work in those small bowls.
If you do some more bowls, how would you consider making them bigger? How big a diameter could you make?
Well, those lampshades are about 270 long and about 150 diameter.
In English, that's about 6 inches by
Yeah.
10 inches.
Thank you, Master.
Yeah. So they're about that high.
Yeah.
And about that diameter. So
What's the integrity of the glass on that?
integrity.
And what's the strength? Are they very fragile or quite strong?
No, they're quite robust. They've got a thickness of about 6 mil on the overall, probably at the bottom.
Yeah.
And then it tapers down to about 3 mil at the rim. And I'll just round off the rim to make it look more refined.
Fascinating. I should think the light, once the light's inside it, will be quite fascinating, the way it shards itself.
Yeah, and that's another aspect of the process, because I've got to try to make the colour intense enough to work really well when there's a bulb inside. And normally on the smaller bowls, or the ones where the thickness of the glass is greater, I would use a pigment ratio of about 1% to the overall volume of glass that I'm using. Whereas on those lights, on the one on the left that you saw there, I'm using about 5% of colour as a ratio of the total weight of glass. Wow. So we're controlling it all with weights and measures, rather like a chef would do if you were weighing out materials for cooking.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite a nice way to work because it's very scientific.
Amazing, great stuff. Well, any more questions, anybody?
A quick one, a silly question, really. Could you make a very large bell, a sort of big bell in glass?
Yeah, I mean that's another thing that I'm really interested in, and it's why I was ringing those vessels, because I'm kind of really intrigued by the way that they sound, and effectively the big lamps that you see at the end there are a kind of bell, and particularly the lead one has a wonderful ring that goes on for several, for practically a minute or longer. And my friend is working with sound a lot, and he's recording all sorts of things and making music from it. And I'm hoping to do a project with him where we make a number of ringing bowls that we can use for an interactive installation, where by casting bowls of different diameters with a foot, as I'm doing there, I would be able to make a vessel which could be rung by the visitor to the installation. And it's interesting because there was an instrument called a glass harmonica, which maybe some of you have seen at a concert performance or in videos, but it's basically like a long line of glass vessels on a revolving center, and the player plays the notes by touching the edge of each one of these bells, and they're all tuned. And I'd quite like to make something that references the glass harmonica. So maybe it's something to think about for the next Glass Biennale. I like the thought of actually people being able to interact with the glass by touching it, or by maybe ringing it with a stick or something. So yeah, that the answer is I think that is a kind of bell in itself. Just depends on how it's hung and how it's rung, I guess.
Yeah, have a listen to this.
Benjamin Franklin saw someone playing a set of water-tuned wine glasses. and thought that this would be a more convenient arrangement. He wanted to do away with the water tuning and wanted to have a lot more glasses and be able to play more than 2 at a time. So voila, one of Franklin's favorite inventions. So these are all basically custom blown wine glasses, and they're all nested inside of each other, and the whole assembly is turning so you can play it somewhat piano-like. So here's a little bit from the Lucia. And Mozart also wrote some music for it.
Amazing.
Fascinating.
Fascinating. One final question from me, Max. How do you obtain your business? Is it, do you have any retailers working, distributing for you, or is it word of mouth and comes straight to you?
It's a very much of a mixture. I'm doing a lot of commission work for other businesses and designers and sometimes artists who are in a certain kind of service field. So we have the baby's hands and feet customers, we have the lighting people, and I've been doing quite a lot of work for lighting specialists recently. We also have some specialist trophies that we make. And then I have my own work, which is probably accounts for about 10% of my business turnover. And my own work is not very much in galleries. I think probably one of the things is that I'm very eclectic, and I do all sorts of different things, and perhaps I haven't become really known for doing one thing in particular. But I'm also selling online, and we've done quite well recently with the Artist's Pledge, where we've put up pieces like the bubble wrap tumblers and the bowls from the demo, of which we made about 6 so far, and they've all sold. So I'm actually finding quite a lot of success with online sales at the moment. If anybody's interested, it's all up on my Instagram feed, which is Max Jacquard, Max Jacquard. And every now and then we put up a few pieces on Artist's Pledge, which is a really lovely idea, because when we reach £1,000 worth of sales, we have to then buy another artist's work for the value of up to £200. So you're kind of putting back in what you earn, as it were. So it's a mixture, and I'm always hopeful of getting more exposure through galleries. And of course, who knows what the future is going to be like with galleries. I think some of the few glass galleries that there are out there have been very hard hit by COVID, and you know, it remains to be seen how sustainable the high-end galleries are, especially in where they are in major cities.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's been absolutely fascinating. I've loved every minute of it. It's absolutely, I mean, it's such a different method of art production to what we have been looking at with blowing glass and things like that.
Yeah.
Bill, you wanting to speak?
I'm just signifying my approval. It's a
Your thumbs up. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. I think we've more or less come to the end of tonight's presentation. Anybody got any more questions?
I mean, I'd probably, if you don't mind, I'd just like to sort of say that it is a very sort of bespoke kind of process that I use. It's very old, and it's also it's very slow because I'm using a number of different materials before I actually get to the glass, and then when the glass comes out of the mold, it then has to be extensively cold worked. So it may seem like quite an inefficient process, but it's a hugely enjoyable process to work with. It's like discovering treasure every time you open a mold. And I actually think that it's quite sustainable because I'm able to work out of a small studio with a very small amount of energy consumption per piece, and I'm only firing the kiln up when I've got my molds all ready to go. I try to, proceed with caution each time I'm making a piece, so as not to make mistakes and waste stuff. And I think that it's a process that produces very precious objects that you can see when you know what's gone into them, how time consuming and how thoughtful that process is. So I hope it's a sustainable process, and I hope it's also a very kind of collectible way to work going forward. I'm always hopeful that people will want to collect the kind of glass that we glass casters will be making.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. You want to close, Richard?
Absolutely. Max, what you have demonstrated today, I spent my working life, as most people on this screen tonight know, I've spent my working life in the glass industry, but never understood how casting of that nature works. It's absolutely wonderful to see it. Thank you very much indeed. And really, the reason I asked about where you sell is so that we can all go and look at your opportunities, and maybe some of us would wish to arrange for something special to be made.
Yeah.
And it looks really tremendous. Thank you very, very much indeed. And Paul, thank you for organising it. As always, we can't do without you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Splendid evening. Thank you so much. Very good indeed. And
Really interesting.
thank you for everybody for joining us as well. As you know, next week we're off to New York to speak to Christopher. And in fact, Max has already said that he'd like to join us too, because he'd be so welcome to do so.
Good.
So I think we can say good night to everybody. Go and have a drink, and dreams to you all. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks, Max.
Good night,
Bye,
everybody.
Max.
Bye.